Midtown was already in chaos when the first soup slammed into the street hard enough to split the asphalt like glass. Cars flipped from the shockwave, storefronts shattered, and civilians ran in blind panic while emergency sirens struggled to rise above the noise. News drones circled overhead, broadcasting the destruction before anyone understood what had caused it. A figure stepped forward through the settling dust, moving with slow, deliberate steps that cracked the pavement beneath his feet. He wasn't rushing, wasn't shouting, and showed no sign of effort. The soup who could lift armored vehicles tried to rise, only realizing too late that his arm had been broken without him even feeling the moment it happened. Homelander arrived in a blur of sound and heat, hovering above the ruined street with his practiced smile already fading. He opened his mouth to assert control, to remind everyone who owned the city, but the stranger never even looked at him. Instead, his eyes drifted across the skyline like a man inspecting a structure that had already failed. What no one realized was that this wasn't the beginning of a fight. Far beyond this city, the consequences of this quiet inspection were already in motion. This isn't a battle, it's a world being judged in real time. Subscribe once, because every decision that follows grows from this moment. If you miss what happens next, you won't understand why this universe never recovers from the presence that just arrived. In a world already addicted to spectacle, the destruction in Midtown should have felt familiar. Sups fought, buildings broke, and Vaught's cameras turned catastrophe into marketing within minutes. But this time, the pattern fractured in a way no one could immediately explain. The soup lying in the crater had not been thrown by another soup, and no known weapon signature matched the impact that had split the street like brittle glass. The figure standing in the settling dust did not posture, did not shout, and did not scan for threats. He walked forward with the slow confidence of someone who did not need to rush because nothing present could meaningfully delay him. His armor bore no logos, no media-friendly design, and no hint of corporate branding. He looked less like a hero and more like a verdict that had already been reached. Above the street, Homelander hovered with a smile that cameras had taught him to maintain even in disaster. His eyes burned red, searching for weakness, searching for a way to frame this as another situation he could dominate. When he spoke, his voice carried the familiar tone of ownership, as if the city itself existed under his authority. The stranger did not respond. He did not even turn his head. His gaze remained fixed on the skyline, on the civilians running, on the helicopters circling, on the advertisements for soup-branded products plastered across digital billboards. It was the look of someone examining a system, not confronting an opponent. Homelander fired first. A twin beam of heat vision cut through the air with enough force to shear through armored vehicles. The blast struck the stranger's chest and filled the street with molten light, forcing bystanders to shield their eyes from the glare. For several long seconds, the attack did not stop. When the light faded, the stranger was still standing in the exact same position. The asphalt beneath him had melted into slag, but his armor remained untouched, his posture unchanged. He looked down at the glowing street as if mildly inconvenienced by the mess. Homelander descended slightly, confusion slipping through the edges of his expression. He had fought sups before, broken them, terrified them, and watched them beg. This was the first time he had seen someone ignore him so completely that it felt like a personal insult. The stranger finally moved. He stepped forward once, then again, closing the distance without any visible acceleration. When he reached the injured soup in the crater, he crouched beside him with the patience of a doctor examining a patient. The soup tried to speak, tried to summon his strength, but his arm hung at an angle that made the attempt pointless. With a simple motion, the stranger placed 2 fingers on the soup's chest and pushed. The pavement cracked deeper, and the soup went silent in an instant. There was no dramatic impact, no drawn-out struggle, just an efficient end delivered without emotion. High above, news helicopters captured everything. Inside the boy's world's largest corporation, alarms were already ringing. Analysts at Vought International replayed the footage frame by frame, trying to classify what they were seeing. No heat signature, no known soup registry match, no compound V markers. The man on their screens did not behave like a hero, a villain, or a terrorist. He behaved like a commander, surveying enemy territory. Miles away, Billy Butcher watched the live feed with a stillness that unsettled the rest of the team. He had seen SUPs tear apart city blocks, but something about this encounter made his instincts tighten rather than flare. The stranger wasn't enjoying this. He wasn't performing. He looked like he had already decided something about the world and was now verifying it. Back in Midtown, Homelander landed on the street with a forceful crack, placing himself directly in the stranger's path. He spoke again, louder this time, voice sharpened by irritation. He demanded answers, demanded identity, demanded recognition in a tone that had broken world leaders and terrified armies. The stranger finally looked at him. It was not a look of challenge or anger. It was the look of a man studying a tool that had been misused for too long. Homelander felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine, a sensation he had never experienced in front of another being. For the first time in years, he felt evaluated rather than admired. Homelander swung. The punch carried enough force to turn armored vehicles into scrap. It connected cleanly with the stranger's jaw and produced a shockwave that shattered nearby windows. Cameras trembled as the street cracked further under the impact. The stranger's head turned slightly from the blow, then it returned to center. He did not retaliate immediately. He simply stared at Homelander for a long, uncomfortable moment that stretched far beyond what anyone expected. It felt less like hesitation and more like confirmation. When he moved, it was faster than anyone could track. His hand closed around Homelander's wrist mid-strike, and with a single controlled twist, he forced the soup to his knees. The street groaned under the pressure as Homelander struggled, not understanding why his strength felt irrelevant in this grip. The stranger leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to Homelander's. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, measured, and devoid of anger. "You are not the problem," he said quietly. "You are the symptom." Then he released him. Homelander stumbled backward, more shocked by the dismissal than by the physical restraint. The stranger turned away as if the encounter had already served its purpose. Around them, the city watched in horrified silence as the most powerful soup on Earth stood there, unsure whether he had just lost or been judged. Sirens grew louder in the distance as military vehicles approached. Vaught's rapid response teams were already moving into position, coordinating with federal authorities who had no idea what they were responding to. Social media feeds exploded with footage of the encounter, but no one could agree on what they had witnessed. The stranger walked down the street, ignoring the forming perimeter, ignoring the weapons being aimed at him. His eyes moved across billboards showing smiling SUPs selling products, across civilians filming him instead of running, across a society that had learned to monetize its own delusion. This was no longer a random incident. This was an inspection. And as he reached the end of the block, the first military helicopter opened fire, its heavy rounds tearing through the air toward him. The bullets struck his armor and fell uselessly to the street like discarded pebbles. He did not stop walking. Behind him, Homelander remained still, watching in silence as something far worse than a new enemy moved through his city. For the first time in his life, he did not feel like the most important being in the sky. Because he had just realized this was not a fight for dominance. This was the beginning of a judgment that had already decided humanity's worth. The helicopters kept firing long after it became obvious the rounds were doing nothing. Tracers filled the air behind the stranger like lines being drawn on a diagram no one understood. Civilians recorded from rooftops and windows, narrating in frightened whispers as if lowering their voices might make the situation more controllable. The stranger did not speed up, did not dodge, and did not acknowledge the attack in any way that suggested he considered it a threat. Inside Vought's command center, analysts rewound the footage of Homelander's failed strike over and over again. They zoomed in on the moment his fist connected, expecting to see some hidden reaction, some sign of injury, or at least resistance. There was none. The stranger had taken the blow like a man brushing dust off his shoulder, and the more they watched it, the less it made sense within the framework of everything they knew about power. Ashley Barrett paced in front of the screens, her voice cracking as she demanded classifications that no one could give her. Was he a new soup? A foreign weapon? A failed Vought experiment from decades ago resurfacing? Every answer sounded absurd the moment it was spoken aloud. Nothing in their database explained why Homelander had looked small. On the street, the stranger finally stopped walking. Not because of the gunfire, and not because of the growing military perimeter, but because of a massive digital billboard towering over the avenue. It displayed smiling members of the Seven endorsing a children's cereal, complete with cartoon versions of themselves encouraging kids to be super. He stood there for several long seconds, staring at it in silence. High above, Homelander watched from the air, trying to rebuild the confidence that had cracked inside him. He told himself this was just another opponent to dominate, another problem to solve in front of cameras. But he couldn't shake the memory of that look, the way the stranger had studied him without fear or admiration, as if Homelander were an entry in a report. On a rooftop several blocks away, Billy Butcher lowered his binoculars slowly. He didn't speak for a while, and that silence worried Huey more than shouting ever could. Butcher had spent his life hatting sups, but this was the first time he had seen something that made them look insignificant. "He's not here for them," Butcher muttered. "He's here for the whole bloody system." Back on the street, armored vehicles screeched into position, forming a barricade ahead of the stranger. Soldiers shouted commands through loudspeakers, their rifles trained on his chest with disciplined fear. The stranger turned away from the billboard and faced them with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving. One soldier fired a rocket launcher. The explosion engulfed the street in fire and smoke, forcing everyone to duck behind cover. When the smoke cleared, the stranger was still standing in the center of the blast radius, his armor blackened slightly by soot but otherwise untouched. He looked at the soldiers not with anger but with something closer to disappointment. Then he moved. He did not charge. He did not leap. He simply walked forward, and every soldier who tried to stand in his path was knocked aside with controlled, minimal force. Rifles bent like soft metal in his hands. Armored doors were peeled open without effort. He moved through the barricade like water flowing around rocks, never accelerating, never pausing. Above, Homelander clenched his fists. The cameras were still rolling, and for the first time he felt like a spectator in his own city. He dove down again, landing between the stranger and the scattered soldiers with visible frustration. "This ends now," Homelander snapped, more to himself than to the stranger. He attacked with everything he had this time. Punches came in rapid succession, shockwaves rippling through the street as each strike landed. Heat vision flared at point-blank range, burning the air around them into shimmering waves. The violence was louder, more desperate, and completely one-sided. The stranger endured it all without stepping back. Finally, he caught Homelander's arm again, but this time he did not twist or throw him. He simply held him in place while the soup struggled like a trapped animal. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Homelander felt something he had only ever inflicted on others. Helplessness. "You have been allowed to exist without purpose," the stranger said calmly. "Your strength serves nothing but ego. Your world applauds you for it." He released Homelander and turned his back on him again. The dismissal hurt more than any blow. Across the city, the footage spread faster than Vought could suppress it. People watched their greatest hero fail to matter in real time. The illusion that SUPs were untouchable began to fracture, not because they had been defeated, but because someone had arrived who did not recognize their importance at all. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley realized the true horror of the situation. This wasn't a public relations disaster. This was an existential one. If the world saw Homelander as irrelevant, then Vaught's entire foundation collapsed with him. Meanwhile, the stranger reached the end of the avenue and paused again. This time, he looked up toward Vought Tower itself, its glass exterior reflecting the burning lights of emergency vehicles below. His gaze lingered there, and for the first time since his arrival, his attention seemed focused on something specific. Butcher noticed it too through his scope. "He's picked a target," he said quietly. In the sky, Homelander followed the stranger's line of sight and felt a chill run through him. He had spent years believing Vought belonged to him, that the company was an extension of his power. Now he realized that to this being, it was simply the heart of the disease. Sirens echoed louder as more forces poured into the city, but the stranger did not acknowledge them. He began walking again, this time directly toward Vought Tower with the steady pace of someone who had already decided what needed to be done. And as he moved, every camera, every drone, every terrified pair of eyes followed him. Because the world had just realized something terrifying. He wasn't trying to defeat their heroes. He was walking toward the source of why those heroes existed at all. Vought Tower had been designed to project invincibility. Its mirrored surface reflected the city like a monument to corporate divinity, a place where power, celebrity, and profit fused into something untouchable. For decades, it had survived scandals, leaks, whistleblowers, and terrorist threats without ever appearing truly vulnerable. Today, the building looked like a target. Inside the upper floors, executives crowded into emergency conference rooms while security teams locked down every entrance. Monitors displayed the live drone feed of the armored stranger walking steadily through blocked streets toward the tower. No one spoke with confidence anymore. Every sentence ended with uncertainty, because none of their usual tools applied to this situation. Ashley Barrett barked orders that sounded increasingly hollow as she realized how little control she actually had. Evacuation plans were discussed, but no one could decide whether fleeing would make them look guilty or terrified. Both felt equally disastrous. Down in the city, civilians had stopped running. They stood on sidewalks and balconies, watching the stranger approach Vought Tower like witnesses to a historical moment they didn't understand. Social media streams showed the same image from dozens of angles, the same silent march toward the symbol of everything they had been taught to trust. High above, Homelander hovered without intervening. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment, but deep down, he didn't know what that moment would look like anymore. Every instinct that had once guided him now felt unreliable in the presence of this being. On a nearby rooftop, Billy Butcher watched through a scope, his expression harder than usual. He had spent years trying to tear Vought down from the outside, and now he was watching someone walk toward it without hesitation, without a plan, without fear. "He's not attacking," Butcher muttered. "He's auditing." The stranger reached the base of Vought Tower and stopped. He looked up at the towering structure for several long seconds, taking in the logos, the glass, the polished presentation of authority. His eyes moved slowly across the building as if reading a report written in architecture. Security teams inside the lobby braced themselves as he approached the main entrance. Dozens of armed guards stood behind reinforced glass, their rifles aimed at his chest. They shouted commands he did not acknowledge. He placed one hand on the glass. The entire entrance caved inward with a sound like a collapsing dam. Shards rained across the marble floor as alarms erupted throughout the building. The guards opened fire immediately, bullets sparking uselessly against his armor as he stepped into the lobby without breaking stride. He did not attack them. He did not even look at them. He walked past as if they were irrelevant details in a much larger calculation. Upstairs, Ashley watched the security feed with growing horror. The stranger moved through the lobby like he belonged there, ignoring resistance with the same indifference he had shown on the street. Elevators were disabled, so he turned toward the central stairwell and began climbing. Each step echoed through the building like a countdown. Homelander landed on the roof, packing in agitation. He felt something slipping away from him, something he couldn't name. This wasn't a battle for control of the city. This was a slow, methodical approach to the heart of the system that had created him. Inside a conference room, executives argued about calling in military strikes on their own building. The absurdity of the suggestion hung in the air, but no one laughed. For the first time, destroying Vought Tower felt like a possible outcome. The stranger reached the executive floors and pushed through reinforced doors that bent under his touch. Employees screamed and scattered as he entered the hallway, his heavy footsteps echoing against polished floors and framed posters of smiling sups. He stopped in front of a wall-sized display showcasing the history of Vaught's heroes. Photographs, awards, marketing milestones, and slogans celebrating decades of manufactured heroism filled the display. He studied it carefully, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Ashley stepped into the hallway with trembling hands, flanked by security who looked far more frightened than she did. She tried to speak with authority, tried to demand an explanation, but her voice faltered the moment his eyes settled on her. He did not ask questions. He did not threaten her. He simply looked at her with a level of understanding that made her feel exposed. "You built a civilization around lies," he said calmly, "and convinced yourselves it was stability." Ashley felt her knees weaken as she realized this man understood Vought better than most of its board members. He wasn't guessing. He had already analyzed them. Below, employees fled down stairwells as the news spread that the stranger had reached the top floors. Panic rippled through the building faster than any official order could contain it. Vaught's illusion of control dissolved in minutes. On the roof, Homelander stared down through the glass panels, watching the scene unfold. For the first time, he understood that this was not about him. This was about the machine that had shaped him, and someone had come to judge it. The stranger walked past Ashley and into the executive conference room. He placed one hand on the massive table where countless decisions about SUPs, media manipulation, and political influence had been made. With a slow, deliberate push, he split the table in half. The sound echoed through the floor like a gunshot. Ashley realized then that he wasn't here to negotiate, and he wasn't here to destroy randomly. He was demonstrating something. Every action was symbolic, precise, and terrifyingly intentional. He turned toward the panoramic windows overlooking the city and stood there silently, observing the skyline. From this height, he could see the billboards, the crowds, the chaos, and the fear spreading through the streets. This was the view from which Vought had shaped the world. And now someone else was evaluating it from the same position. Down below, sirens filled the city as news outlets reported that Vought Tower had been breached. Governments began issuing emergency statements, but none of them had language prepared for what was happening. They were witnessing the collapse of a corporate empire not through scandal, but through silent condemnation. The stranger finally turned away from the window. Without speaking another word, he began walking toward the roof access door. Because he had finished inspecting the disease. And now he was ready to confront the symptom standing above it. The door to the rooftop access burst open with a metallic groan that echoed across the skyline. Wind rushed into the stairwell as the stranger stepped out onto the roof of Vought Tower without hesitation. The city stretched endlessly behind him, sirens and flashing lights painting the streets in chaotic patterns far below. At the center of the roof, Homelander stood waiting. He didn't hover this time. He didn't posture for cameras. He stood on the concrete like an ordinary man forced into a situation he did not understand. The usual smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, controlled expression that betrayed how much this encounter had unsettled him. The stranger stopped several meters away, studying Homelander with the same calm attention he had given the billboard, the soldiers, and the executives. There was no hostility in his eyes, only assessment. The silence between them stretched long enough that the city noise below began to feel distant. Homelander spoke first, his voice lower than usual, stripped of theatrical confidence. "You don't belong here." The stranger tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. "Neither do you," he replied evenly. The words landed harder than any punch. Homelander felt something twist inside his chest, a sensation that felt dangerously close to doubt. He attacked again, not with rage, but with a desperate need to reassert control over a situation slipping through his fingers. They moved across the rooftop in a blur of motion. Concrete shattered under their feet as Homelander unleashed everything he had, each strike strong enough to demolish buildings. The stranger absorbed the blows without losing ground, countering only when necessary, each movement efficient and precise. He grabbed Homelander mid-charge and drove him into the rooftop hard enough to crack the reinforced surface. Before Homelander could recover, the stranger lifted him by the collar and held him suspended above the city. From this height the streets looked small, the crowds looked fragile. "Look," the stranger said calmly. Homelander struggled, but the grip was absolute. He followed the stranger's gaze downward and saw something he had never truly paid attention to before. People were not cheering. They were not filming with excitement. They were running, hiding, and panicking. They were afraid. "You were meant to protect them," the stranger continued. "Instead, they endure you." Homelander's eyes flickered with something unfamiliar. For the first time, he saw the city not as an audience, but as a population living under constant tension. The realization hit him harder than the physical restraint. The stranger released him, letting him fall back onto the cracked rooftop. Across the city, live feeds captured everything. News anchors struggled to narrate what they were seeing because there was no template for this. This wasn't a fight between heroes. It was an exposure of something everyone had quietly accepted for years. On a distant rooftop, Billy Butcher lowered his scope again, his mind racing. He had always believed sups were the problem, but watching this encounter forced a new thought into his head. Maybe sups were only the surface of something far deeper and far more rotten. Inside Vought Tower, employees crowded around screens in stunned silence. They weren't watching Homelander lose. They were watching him being understood in a way no one had ever dared to articulate. Back on the roof, Homelander stood slowly, breathing harder than he ever had in a fight. He didn't charge again. He didn't threaten. He just stared at the stranger, trying to figure out why this felt worse than physical defeat. "You think you're better than us," Homelander said quietly. The stranger shook his head. "No, I think you are proof of what this world chose to become." The words hung in the air as helicopters circled at a safe distance, unsure whether to intervene. The military had orders to stand down for now, not because they understood the situation, but because every attempt to interfere had proven meaningless. The stranger walked past Homelander toward the edge of the rooftop. He looked down at the city again, his expression unreadable. To anyone watching, it looked like a man admiring the view. But to Homelander, it felt like a judge considering a sentence. Sirens echoed through the streets below as civilians flooded out of buildings, unsure whether to flee or stay. For the first time in years, the public wasn't looking to Homelander for reassurance. Their attention was fixed entirely on the stranger. And that shift terrified him more than anything. The stranger turned his back to the city and faced Homelander one last time. "This world confuses power with purpose," he said calmly. You are worshipped not because you are needed, but because you are feared. Homelander had no response. Every instinct he relied on failed him in this moment. He felt small, not because he had been overpowered, but because he had been reduced to a symptom of something larger. The stranger stepped toward the edge of the roof. Then he simply walked off. He did not fall. He descended with controlled weight, landing in the street below hard enough to crack the pavement again. Crowds scattered as he began walking through the city once more, ignoring the chaos he had left behind. Up on the roof, Homelander stood alone, staring down at the figure moving through his city like it no longer belonged to him. Across New York, something subtle but irreversible had happened. People were no longer asking if Homelander could stop this man. They were asking why he couldn't. And as the stranger disappeared into the streets, heading deeper into the heart of the city, the realization spread faster than any news broadcast. This was not about defeating heroes. This was about exposing the truth of what those heroes had become. By nightfall, New York no longer looked like a city reacting to a soup incident. It looked like a city preparing for war. Military convoys sealed bridges, fighter jets circled at high altitude, and federal command vehicles lined entire avenues with antenna arrays and mobile radar systems searching for anything they could classify. No one used the word soup anymore in official briefings. Because whatever this was, it did not fit the category. Inside underground command centers, generals watched thermal feeds of the stranger walking through Manhattan at an unhurried pace. He had not attacked civilians. He had not targeted infrastructure. He had not issued threats. And somehow, that made him far more dangerous than an invading army. "He's mapping us," one analyst said quietly. Several miles away, Billy Butcher watched military deployments through stolen surveillance feeds. For the first time, he felt a strange detachment from the chaos. He knew this level of force wouldn't matter. He had seen the stranger handle Homelander like an inconvenience. "They're about to learn what Vought already has," Butcher muttered. "You can't scare something that isn't impressed by you." The stranger stopped in the middle of a wide intersection as armored units formed a perimeter around him. Tanks aimed their cannons. Soldiers took positions behind concrete barriers. Loudspeakers ordered him to stand down in rehearsed, disciplined voices that echoed off empty buildings. He looked around slowly, taking in the formation with the same thoughtful expression he had worn all day. It was not fear in his eyes. It was evaluation. The first tank fired. The shell struck him with a deafening explosion that shattered nearby windows and filled the street with smoke and debris. For a brief moment, the world disappeared in fire. Then the smoke began to clear, and he was still standing in the exact same place. The tanks fired again, then again, until the street looked like a war zone. Each impact shook the ground, but when visibility returned, the stranger remained motionless, his armor scorched but intact. Then he began walking forward. Soldiers fired everything they had. Heavy rounds sparked off his chest. Rockets detonated around him. He walked through it all without changing pace, closing the distance between himself and the armored line like an approaching storm that refused to be hurried. One tank tried to reverse. He reached it before it could move. With one hand, he gripped the turret and twisted. Metal screamed as the cannon bent sideways like soft clay. He pushed the vehicle onto its side with controlled force, not violently, but decisively, as if removing an obstacle from his path. The soldiers nearest him dropped their weapons and fled. Above the chaos, fighter jets screamed through the sky. Missiles streaked downward in coordinated volleys, slamming into the intersection with enough force to carve a crater into the city block. Fire engulfed the street, lighting up the night like a second sun. Cameras from every angle captured what happened next. The stranger stepped out of the flames. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley Barrett stared at the screens in disbelief. This wasn't damage control anymore. This was the world throwing everything it had at one individual and failing in public. On a distant rooftop, Butcher watched through binoculars, his expression grim. "He's not fighting back," Huey said quietly beside him. Butcher nodded. "That's the problem, he doesn't need to." High above, Homelander observed from the sky, silent and tense. Every missile that failed, every tank that crumpled, made him feel less like the apex of this world and more like an afterthought. The stranger finally stopped walking again. Around him, the street burned, vehicles overturned, smoke rising into the night sky. He looked at the destruction not with satisfaction but with cold recognition. This was how the world defended itself. With noise, with force, with panic. He turned slowly in a full circle, observing the chaos created in an attempt to stop him. His gaze lingered on the fire spreading into nearby buildings, on civilians being evacuated from apartments that had never been part of the fight. He had not caused this destruction. They had. And that realization seemed to confirm something for him. Miles away, military commanders received new orders. Escalation protocols were being discussed at levels of government that had never been activated for a domestic situation. Words like experimental payloads and last resort authorization entered conversations for the first time. Butcher listened in through hacked channels and felt a growing sense of dread. "They're going to make it worse," he muttered. "They think this is about stopping him, it's not." Back at the intersection, the stranger resumed walking. He stepped over wreckage, through flames, and past abandoned weapons as if navigating debris after a natural disaster. He did not hurry. He did not pursue anyone. He simply continued forward. And as he moved, something unsettling began to spread through the soldiers, the officials, and the civilians watching from afar. This man was not trying to win a battle. He was watching how the world chose to respond to him. Every missile, every bullet, every panicked command was data. And the conclusion he was reaching grew clearer with every failed attempt to stop him. Because this world did not know how to respond to power without abusing it. By midnight, the decision had been made far above the level of generals and politicians. The situation had been elevated to a classification reserved for existential threats, the kind normally discussed only in simulations and sealed briefings. The stranger was no longer treated as a hostile individual. He was being categorized as a force that had to be removed at any cost. No one stopped to ask whether removal was even possible. In a secured command bunker, analysts tracked his slow progress through Manhattan using satellites and drone feeds. They noticed something unnerving in the pattern of his movement. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't heading toward symbolic landmarks or centers of government. He was walking through population density. "He's studying civilian behavior," one analyst whispered. "He's watching how people react under stress." Several miles away, Billy Butcher listened to intercepted chatter through a headset, his jaw tightening as he realized what was about to happen. He had heard this tone before in military channels. It was the tone used when someone had decided that collateral damage was acceptable. "They're about to throw something ugly at him," Butcher said, "and he's going to watch them do it." Above the Atlantic, a stealth bomber altered its flight path. Back in the city, the stranger stopped in the middle of a deserted avenue. Smoke still drifted between buildings from earlier strikes, and emergency vehicles struggled to navigate blocked streets. He looked around calmly, observing the absence of civilians now that evacuation orders had spread. He seemed to understand what was coming. High above, Homelander hovered in the night sky, listening to military frequencies he wasn't supposed to access. Even he felt uneasy at the coded language being used. This was beyond conventional force. This was desperation dressed as strategy. The missile fell silently at first. Then the sky split open with a blinding flash that turned night into white daylight. The detonation ripped through multiple city blocks with a shockwave so violent it shattered windows miles away. Buildings groaned, streets buckled, and firestorms erupted in the blast radius. From rooftops and helicopters at safe distances, cameras captured the expanding destruction with horrified clarity. When the light faded, a smoking crater replaced the avenue where the stranger had stood. For several long seconds, there was nothing but fire and debris. Then movement. He stepped up out of the crater. His armor was scorched black, fragments of concrete sliding off his shoulders as he climbed back onto the ruined street. He paused there, not because he was injured, but because he was looking at what the blast had done to the surrounding buildings. Fires raged in apartments that had been evacuated minutes earlier. Structural collapses sent debris cascading into streets that had nothing to do with him. Emergency crews scrambled to contain damage that he had not caused. He turned slowly, surveying the destruction in a full circle. And for the first time since arriving in this world, there was a subtle change in his expression. Not anger. Understanding. Far away, Butcher lowered his headset slowly. "They just proved his point," he said quietly. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley Barrett watched the feeds with trembling hands. This was no longer about brand damage or corporate survival. This was the world exposing itself under pressure, and the stranger was witnessing all of it. In the sky, Homelander felt something twist in his chest as he realized what had happened. The military had tried to kill one man and ended up tearing apart their own city. And the man they had targeted stood there, unharmed, watching the consequences. The stranger began walking again, stepping through burning debris with deliberate calm. His eyes scanned the destruction with a look that felt disturbingly analytical. Every ruined building, every panicked siren, every frantic rescue effort was being cataloged. This was not a battle he was losing. This was evidence he was gathering. On secure lines, government officials began arguing about the next step. Some demanded even greater force. Others hesitated, recognizing that each escalation only validated whatever conclusion the stranger was forming about humanity. But no one knew what that conclusion was. Back on the street, the stranger stopped in front of a collapsed apartment complex. Firefighters struggled to clear rubble while shouting to one another over the roar of flames. He watched them for several seconds, observing how they worked together without panic, how they risked themselves for strangers. He did not interfere. He simply watched. For the first time, his gaze lingered not on destruction, but on cooperation, on effort, on the small acts of responsibility happening in the shadow of a disaster he did not cause. Then he turned away and continued walking. But the direction he chose this time was different. He was no longer heading randomly through the city. He was moving with purpose toward something far more specific. Because after witnessing how this world used power and fear, and how ordinary people acted in crisis, he had gathered enough information. And he had begun forming a judgment. By early morning, the fires across Manhattan had been reduced to smoke and sirens. Emergency crews worked through exhaustion, pulling civilians from damaged buildings and sealing off entire districts that looked like they had survived a war. News channels no longer speculated about who the stranger was. They focused instead on the question no one could answer. What did he want? The stranger walked through the gray dawn without interruption. No soldiers blocked his path now. No aircraft circled overhead. The world had learned, at least temporarily, that throwing force at him only made things worse. That absence of resistance made his presence feel even heavier, like a verdict approaching without noise. On a rooftop several blocks away, Billy Butcher tracked him through binoculars with a frown that hadn't left his face all night. Butcher had expected chaos, violence, maybe even a rampage. Instead, he was watching something far more unsettling unfold. "He's done testing," Butcher muttered, Now he's deciding. Inside Vought Tower, exhausted executives stared at live feeds with hollow expressions. Ashley Barrett no longer shouted orders. She simply watched, knowing that nothing they did mattered unless the stranger chose to involve them again. High above the skyline, Homelander floated silently, keeping his distance. He had stopped trying to intervene because every attempt had made him feel smaller. Now he watched like everyone else, waiting to see what this being would do next. The stranger turned into a residential district that had not been touched by the fighting. People stood in doorways and on sidewalks, watching him approach with fear that kept them rooted in place. No one screamed. No one ran. They simply stared, unsure whether this was the end of something or the beginning. He walked past them without acknowledgement, his gaze scanning faces, homes, and the quiet signs of normal life returning after chaos. Children clung to parents. Neighbors helped each other clear debris. Strangers shared water bottles and blankets. He slowed slightly as he observed. Several blocks later, he stopped in front of a small community center where volunteers distributed supplies to displaced families. He stood there for a long time, watching people organize themselves without instruction, without cameras, and without any soup involvement. This was not the world Vought had advertised. This was something else. Butcher saw it too from his vantage point and felt a strange tension in his chest. For years, he had believed the world was rotten because of SUPs. Now he wondered if the rot went deeper, into the structures that had allowed SUPs to dominate in the first place. The stranger resumed walking, but his direction had clearly changed. He was no longer observing randomly. He was moving toward a conclusion, following a path that only made sense to him. By mid-morning, government officials received reports that he was heading toward a secure biomedical research facility on the outskirts of the city. The facility had no public connection to Vought, but several classified files tied it directly to Compound V research and long-term genetic studies. Butcher's eyes widened when he intercepted the location. "He's found the source," he said quietly. Inside the facility, alarms began to sound as security teams prepared for an encounter they knew they could not survive. Scientists scrambled to lock down laboratories and destroy sensitive data, unsure whether hiding evidence would help or make things worse. The stranger arrived at the main entrance and paused. He looked at the building the same way he had looked at Vought Tower, with patient recognition. He did not need signs or files to know what was inside. The patterns of this world had already revealed it to him. Security doors slammed shut. Automated turrets deployed from hidden compartments, tracking his movements with red targeting lasers. For several seconds, the facility bristled with defensive readiness. He stepped forward. The turrets fired in unison, filling the air with a deafening barrage of gunfire. The rounds sparked uselessly against his armor as he walked through the storm without slowing. When he reached the doors, he placed both hands on the reinforced steel and pulled. The metal tore open with a shriek. Inside, scientists and guards scattered in panic as he entered the facility. He moved through sterile hallways with the same calm purpose he had shown everywhere else, ignoring resistance as if it were background noise. He stopped in front of a sealed laboratory marked with hazard warnings and genetic containment symbols. This was where Compound V had been refined. He placed his hand on the door and crushed the locking mechanism. Inside, rows of samples, research logs, and experimental materials filled the room with evidence of decades of manipulation. He walked between the tables slowly, examining vials and data screens with quiet focus. He did not destroy anything yet. He was confirming. Outside, Butcher watched live feeds from stolen security cameras and felt a chill run through him. This was no longer about SUPs or heroes. This was about the foundation that had allowed them to exist. The stranger picked up a vial of Compound V and held it up to the light. The blue liquid shimmered faintly, representing everything this world had done to alter the balance of nature for profit and control. His expression hardened slightly. For the first time since arriving, his judgment had a clear target. And everyone watching realized the same thing at once. He had finished observing. Now he was about to act on what he had learned. Inside the laboratory, the air felt unnaturally still as the stranger held the vial of compound V up to the overhead lights. The liquid glowed faintly, beautiful in a way that hid the damage it had done to the natural order of this world. Around him, computer screens displayed decades of research logs, genetic trials, and recorded successes that Vought had celebrated as milestones. He placed the vial back on the table with deliberate care. Then he began moving through the lab, examining equipment, reading data panels, and studying the infrastructure that had made soup creation scalable. He was not searching for weaknesses. He was identifying how deeply this corruption had spread. Outside, security personnel fled the building in waves. No one tried to stop him anymore. News helicopters circled at a distance, broadcasting every movement to a world that watched in silent disbelief. On a rooftop miles away, Billy Butcher lowered his binoculars slowly, dread settling into his voice. "He's not here to fight sups," Butcher said. "He's here to erase the reason they exist." Inside Vought Tower, Ashley Barrett stared at the feed from the research facility, her hands shaking. She understood what that building represented. If it fell, Vought would lose not just control of sups, but the ability to ever create them again. In the sky above the city, Homelander hovered with a growing sense of unease. He had always believed his power came from being special. Now he was watching someone treat the source of that power like a disease. Back in the lab, the stranger finally acted. He began dismantling the facility with calm precision. He did not smash equipment blindly. He removed power cores, crushed server banks, and tore out containment units with methodical efficiency. Every action targeted the infrastructure that allowed Compound V to be produced and stored. Alarms blared as containment systems failed. Backup generators sparked and died as he crushed them in his hands. Rows of refrigeration units fell apart under controlled strikes, spilling vials across the floor that shattered harmlessly into glowing puddles. He moved through the lab like a surgeon, removing a tumor. Scientists watching remotely realized the horror of what was happening. This wasn't vandalism. This was permanent erasure. Years of research, billions of dollars, and the foundation of the soup economy were being dismantled in minutes. Outside, Butcher watched the feed with a conflicted expression. This was everything he had wanted for years, and yet it felt terrifying in a way he hadn't expected. "He's doing what we couldn't," Huey whispered. Butcher nodded slowly. "Yeah, and he's not asking what happens after." The stranger reached the central storage vault where the largest reserves of Compound V were kept. Thick steel doors guarded it, reinforced to withstand explosions and breaches. He placed his hands on either side and pulled. The doors folded inward like paper. Inside, shelves lined the walls with thousands of vials glowing in cold blue light. The sight would have been beautiful to anyone who believed in soup supremacy. To him, it looked like evidence of a civilization that had tampered with forces it did not understand. He stepped inside and paused. Then he began crushing the shelves. Glass shattered by the hundreds as the vials broke under controlled strikes. Blue liquid poured across the floor and drained into the facility's waste systems, rendering the compound useless. He worked steadily, ensuring nothing remained intact. Across the world, governments and corporations watched this destruction unfold in real time. They realized something too late. Even if they stopped him now, the damage was already irreversible. Homelander descended toward the facility, unable to stay away any longer. He landed outside the building, staring at the broken entrance with growing agitation. For the first time, he understood that this was about more than humiliation. This man was erasing the reason Homelander existed. He stepped inside cautiously and followed the trail of destruction into the laboratory. The sight of shattered equipment and ruined compound V hit him like a physical blow. He found the stranger standing in the center of the ruined vault, surrounded by glowing liquid and broken glass. "Stop," Homelander said, his voice unsteady. The stranger turned slowly to face him. "This is the source of your imbalance," he said calmly. "It must be removed." Homelander clenched his fists, anger and fear mixing in ways he had never experienced before. He attacked again, not to dominate, but to protect something he didn't fully understand. The fight lasted seconds. The stranger caught him mid-strike and slammed him into the floor hard enough to crack the reinforced concrete. He held him there effortlessly, speaking in the same measured tone he had used all day. "You are not being punished," he said. "You are being corrected." He released Homelander and stepped away, returning his attention to the destruction. Homelander remained on the ground, stunned not by pain, but by the realization that his existence had just been labeled an error. The stranger finished dismantling the vault and walked out of the facility without looking back. Behind him, alarms screamed over a building that could no longer fulfill its purpose. Butcher watched him exit and felt the weight of what had just happened settle into his chest. Compound V production was over. Not slowed, not interrupted. Ended. And as the stranger stepped into the daylight again, the world understood something that no one had been prepared to face. This was no longer about judging heroes. This was about correcting the foundation of the world itself. News of the destroyed facility spread faster than any official statement could contain it. Governments tried to suppress the footage, Vought tried to deny what had happened, and military officials refused to comment, but the images were already everywhere. The glowing rivers of ruined Compound V on the laboratory floor became the symbol of something much larger than corporate loss. For the first time in decades, the world understood that the age of creating new sups had ended overnight. In Vought Tower, Ashley Barrett sat motionless in a conference room surrounded by silent executives. No one argued. No one shouted. They simply stared at screens showing their greatest asset being erased with calm, deliberate finality. This wasn't a crisis they could spin. This was extinction. Across the city, sups began to panic. Not publicly, not yet, but in private calls and frantic messages between one another. For years, they had lived with the quiet assurance that if anything happened to them, Vought could always replace them. That safety net was gone. They were no longer renewable. They were finite. On a rooftop overlooking the skyline, Billy Butcher watched the city with an expression that bordered on disbelief. This was the outcome he had dreamed of for years, but seeing it happen so effortlessly felt less like victory and more like witnessing a natural disaster. "He didn't kill them," Butcher said quietly. "He made them mortal." High above, Homelander hovered in silence, staring down at the streets. Something fundamental had shifted inside him. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of time pressing against him. He was no longer part of an endless line of replacements. He was a single, irreplaceable anomaly. And that terrified him. The stranger walked through the city again, his pace unchanged, his expression unreadable. But now people were not watching him with panic. They were watching him with a strange, cautious understanding. Something in the atmosphere had shifted. Fear had been replaced by uncertainty. Civilians whispered as he passed. Not about invasion, not about war, but about the realization that their world had been built on something artificial for far too long. Several blocks ahead, a group of lesser-known sups gathered in the street, blocking his path. They had coordinated through private channels, driven by a mix of fear and anger. If this man was destroying the source of their power, then he was their enemy. They attacked together. Powers flared across the street in a chaotic display of desperation. Energy blasts, super strength, and enhanced speed filled the air as they charged him from all directions. For a brief moment, it looked like a conventional soup battle. It ended almost immediately. The stranger moved through them with brutal efficiency, disabling each one without visible effort. Limbs were broken, bodies were slammed into the pavement, and powers were rendered meaningless against his overwhelming strength. Within seconds, the street was silent except for groans of pain. He did not kill them. He left them alive on the ground, broken but breathing. Because they were no longer threats. They were evidence. From nearby buildings, civilians watched the encounter with wide eyes. For years, they had seen SUPs as untouchable forces of nature. Now they saw them lying helpless on the pavement, defeated by someone who treated them like obstacles rather than adversaries. The illusion of supremacy shattered in real time. Butcher observed the aftermath through binoculars and felt a grim understanding settle into place. "He's not hunting them," he said. "He's proving a point to everyone watching." Inside Vought Tower, Ashley realized the public relations nightmare unfolding. SUPs were no longer symbols of safety or power. They were being exposed as dependent creations, fragile without the system that sustained them. And the stranger was the one revealing it. Homelander landed several streets away, watching from a distance as the defeated SUPs were loaded into ambulances. He felt a growing isolation he had never experienced before. The world he dominated was being dismantled, and he couldn't stop it. He approached the stranger cautiously this time, not with aggression, but with something closer to desperation. "What do you want?" Homelander asked. The stranger turned toward him slowly. "I wanted to understand this world," he replied calmly. "Now I do." Homelander waited for more, but none came. The silence stretched painfully as the meaning settled in. This wasn't about negotiation. It wasn't about demands. The stranger had gathered all the information he needed. And his conclusion did not require discussion. Across the city, people began stepping out into the streets again. Not to protest, not to flee, but to look. They watched SUPs being treated like ordinary injured individuals. They watched emergency responders prioritize civilians over celebrities. Something subtle but irreversible was happening. Respect was shifting. The stranger resumed walking, leaving Homelander standing alone in the middle of the street. This time, Homelander did not follow. He simply watched, feeling the weight of a world that no longer revolved around him. For decades, SUPs had stood above society as gods manufactured by a corporation. In less than a day, that hierarchy had collapsed without a single speech, without a revolution, without a war. It had been dismantled by observation and precision. Butcher lowered his binoculars and exhaled slowly. "He's already changed the world," Huey said beside him. Butcher nodded, and he hasn't even started the worst part yet. Because everyone watching felt the same unsettling realization. Destroying Compound V and humiliating SUPs was not the end of his judgment. It was preparation for something far more permanent. By afternoon, the city had settled into an uneasy quiet that felt more unnatural than the chaos before it. Fires were out, streets were cleared, and emergency crews worked with exhausted focus. But beneath the surface calm, a realization had begun to spread through officials, civilians, and SUPs alike. The stranger had finished dealing with the symptoms. Now he was turning his attention to the cause. He walked through Manhattan without interruption, no longer observed by military drones or blocked by armed units. Governments had issued stand-down orders not out of strategy, but out of fear of provoking further consequences. The world had learned that reacting to him blindly only made things worse. On a rooftop overlooking a busy avenue, Billy Butcher watched through binoculars as the stranger passed through crowds that parted instinctively to let him through. No one screamed. No one ran. They simply watched, unsure whether they were witnessing salvation or the beginning of something far darker. "He's not looking at sups anymore," Butcher muttered. "He's watching people." Inside Vought Tower, Ashley Barrett noticed the same thing on surveillance feeds. The stranger's gaze had changed. He no longer studied infrastructure or symbols of power. He was observing how civilians interacted now that the illusion of soup dominance had cracked. He stopped at intersections and watched traffic patterns. He paused outside stores and watched how people argued, cooperated, and ignored one another. He observed news screens in shop windows where anchors tried to explain events they did not understand. He was studying behavior. High above, Homelander floated silently, following from a distance. For the first time, he realized this situation was no longer about him or Vought. The stranger was evaluating the species that had allowed Vought to exist. That realization frightened him more than any physical confrontation. The stranger entered a public park where displaced families rested under emergency tents. Volunteers distributed food and blankets while medics treated minor injuries. Children played quietly in corners, trying to distract themselves from the events of the night before. He stood at the edge of the scene for several minutes, watching. No one approached him. No one dared to ask questions. They simply continued helping each other as if pretending he wasn't there might keep the moment stable. His eyes followed a young boy handing his water bottle to an older woman without being told. They shifted to two strangers lifting debris together without speaking. He watched exhaustion, fear, kindness, and selfishness play out in equal measure. Butcher saw the same thing through his lens and felt a cold understanding settle into place. "He's measuring them," he said, "same way he measured the sups." Several blocks away, an argument broke out between two men over access to a supply crate. Shouting escalated into shoving until volunteers stepped in to separate them. The stranger's gaze lingered there longer than anywhere else. He was not judging individuals. He was observing patterns. Inside a news van parked nearby, reporters whispered into microphones, trying to narrate what they were seeing. They had no idea that their words, their framing, and their tone were also part of what the stranger was evaluating. He left the park and continued walking through the city, passing hospitals, shelters, and storefronts. Everywhere he went, people acted like people always had under stress. Some helped, some panicked, some exploited the situation for attention or profit. He saw all of it. Homelander descended to street level again, keeping a cautious distance as he followed. He felt strangely exposed, like he was watching a report being written about a world he had taken for granted. "What are you looking for?" Homelander finally asked. The stranger stopped but did not turn around. "I am determining whether this world deserves correction," he replied calmly. The word hung in the air like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Butcher, listening through a directional mic, froze at the phrasing. "That's it," he whispered. "That's what this has all been leading to." The stranger resumed walking, his pace unchanged, but his purpose now unmistakable. He had gathered enough information about sups, about corporations, and now about humanity itself. The judgment was forming. Across the city, people began to feel it without understanding why. A tension settled into the atmosphere, a sense that something far larger than property damage or corporate collapse was approaching. This was no longer about what had happened. It was about what he was going to decide. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley realized the same horrifying truth. They had all assumed he came here to fight. They were wrong. He had come here to observe. And now that observation was nearly complete. The stranger stopped in the middle of a busy avenue and looked up at the skyline one final time. His gaze moved slowly across the city he had studied from every angle. This was not the look of a conqueror. It was the look of a judge preparing to speak. And everyone watching understood something that made their blood run cold. Whatever he decided next would not be about sups, or Vought, or the military. It would be about humanity itself. By evening, the city felt like it was holding its breath. Traffic had resumed in limited lanes. Emergency lights still flashed at distant intersections. News anchors spoke in hushed, uncertain tones, as if raising their voices might provoke something worse. People moved carefully through streets that had not yet processed what had happened to them in the last 24 hours. In the center of it all, the stranger stood motionless in a wide avenue, looking up at the skyline as if reading something written across the buildings themselves. On a nearby rooftop, Billy Butcher watched through binoculars without blinking. He had stopped trying to predict what would happen next. Now he was simply waiting for the moment this being decided the world's fate. "He's done gathering evidence," Butcher said quietly. "Now he's thinking." High above, Homelander hovered in silence, no longer attempting to hide the tension in his posture. He felt like a bystander to a trial where he was both a witness and an exhibit. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley Barrett stared at the live feeds with hollow eyes. The screens no longer showed destruction or combat. They showed stillness. And somehow, that stillness felt more dangerous than anything before it. The stranger began walking again, slowly, deliberately, through streets filled with cautious civilians. People stepped aside instinctively, creating a path without being asked. They did not shout at him. They did not beg him. They simply watched, aware that they were being seen in a way that felt deeply uncomfortable. He passed by a convenience store where the owner was arguing with customers about price-gouging bottled water. He paused there briefly, observing the exchange with quiet attention. Then he continued walking. Several blocks later, he stopped near a group of volunteers cleaning debris from a sidewalk without expectation of reward. His gaze lingered there longer. He was not tallying good and bad. He was weighing tendencies. Butcher noticed the pattern and felt dread settle into his stomach. This wasn't random observation. This was the final stage of a decision-making process that had begun the moment the stranger arrived. "He's not judging moments," Butcher said. "He's judging what people default to when things break." Homelander descended to street level again, walking a short distance behind the stranger. He felt smaller than he ever had, like a child following an adult who had already decided his future. "You're going to punish them," Homelander said quietly. The stranger stopped and turned slightly, not fully facing him. "I am deciding whether they require correction," he replied calmly. The distinction made Homelander uneasy. Punishment implied anger. Correction implied something colder, something more permanent. The stranger resumed walking, turning into a wide public square where hundreds of civilians had gathered. Some were protesting Vought. Some were demanding answers from the government. Others simply stood in clusters, trying to understand how their world had changed overnight. He stepped into the center of the square and stood still. The crowd slowly quieted as people recognized him. A wide circle formed around him without any instruction. Phones were raised, cameras recording, but no one spoke loudly. The air felt heavy with expectation. He looked around at the faces surrounding him. Fear, confusion, anger, hope. All of it mixed together in a way that felt deeply human. On the rooftop, Butcher lowered his binoculars, unable to shake the feeling that this moment mattered more than all the destruction before it. "This is it," he muttered. Homelander stood at the edge of the crowd, watching with the same tense stillness. For once, no one was looking at him. Every eye was fixed on the stranger. The man who had ignored SUPs, ignored armies, and ignored corporations was now standing among ordinary people, observing them in silence. Minutes passed without a word. The longer he stood there, the more uncomfortable the crowd became. It felt like being stared at by someone who could see past appearances into something deeper and less flattering. Finally, he spoke. "Your world created power without responsibility," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the square without effort. "You allowed illusion to replace truth. You accepted imbalance because it was convenient." No one interrupted, no one shouted back. "You are not evil," he continued. "You are careless." The words landed with a strange weight, not accusatory, but deeply unsettling. People shifted uncomfortably, as if recognizing something they had always known but never admitted. He turned slowly, taking in the full crowd one last time. "I have seen enough." A ripple of unease spread through the square. People looked at one another, unsure whether to run or listen. On the rooftop, Butcher felt his heart pound. "He made the decision," he whispered. Homelander's eyes widened slightly as he realized the same thing. This was no longer observation. This was the moment the judgment finalized in the stranger's mind. The man stepped away from the center of the crowd and began walking out of the square without another word. People parted automatically, watching him go with a mixture of fear and dread. Because they understood something instinctively. He had not spoken to them for their benefit. He had spoken to confirm his conclusion. And as he disappeared down the street, the city felt a subtle, irreversible shift in the air. The verdict had formed, and whatever came next would not be a reaction. It would be a correction already set in motion. Night returned to New York with an unnatural calm that felt staged, as if the city itself were waiting for permission to continue existing. Traffic lights blinked over half-empty streets. Emergency vehicles idled without urgency. News broadcasts repeated the same footage from earlier in the day because nothing new was happening, and that absence of events felt more threatening than chaos ever had. The stranger walked alone through this quiet, his pace unchanged, his expression set with the same calm certainty he had carried since arriving. But now, there was no more observation in his eyes, no more evaluation, only resolve. On a distant rooftop, Billy Butcher followed him through binoculars with a sense of dread he could not shake. Butcher had spent his life trying to tear this world down, but now he realized he had never imagined what it would look like if someone truly capable of doing it decided to act. "He's not looking anymore," Butcher said quietly. "He's moving with a plan." Across the skyline, Homelander watched from the air, no longer pretending he could influence what was happening. He followed at a distance, feeling the weight of a world that had stopped revolving around him and started orbiting someone else entirely. The stranger crossed bridges and avenues without obstruction, heading toward the heart of Manhattan where infrastructure, data centers, and communication hubs connected the city to the rest of the country. He was no longer interested in symbols like Vought Tower or laboratories filled with Compound V. He was targeting something more fundamental. He reached a major power distribution substation surrounded by thick fencing and guarded by armed security. The guards raised their weapons instinctively, but something in his approach made them hesitate. They had seen the footage. They knew how this would end. He placed his hands on the reinforced gate and tore it open without effort. Inside, he moved through rows of transformers and control units with focused precision. He did not destroy everything blindly. He removed key components, crushed central relays, and disabled control systems that regulated the city's electrical grid. Lights across several districts flickered and went dark. Emergency systems kicked in immediately, but he had already moved deeper into the facility, dismantling the backups with the same methodical calm. One by one, entire sections of Manhattan lost power, not in an explosion, but in a controlled, deliberate shutdown. From rooftops and helicopters, cameras captured the city dimming block by block. Butcher lowered his binoculars, understanding dawning slowly. "He's not attacking them," he said. He's taking away what lets them pretend everything's fine. Homelander hovered in the darkening sky, watching neighborhoods fade into shadow. For the first time, he saw the city without glowing billboards, without bright towers, without the artificial shine that had defined it for years. The stranger left the substation and continued walking. He moved next toward a major data routing center where financial networks, media broadcasts, and government communications intersected. Security teams evacuated before he arrived. They knew better than to stand in his way. Inside, he dismantled servers and communication hubs with precise force, destroying the digital infrastructure that allowed information to be controlled, shaped, and distributed at scale. News feeds went offline. Trading systems stalled. Government channels fell silent. The world did not explode into panic. It fell into confusion. Across the city, people stepped outside their darkened buildings and looked around with uncertain expressions. Without screens, without constant updates, without digital noise, they were left with only each other and the quiet. The stranger walked through the streets again, observing the result of his actions. He watched neighbors speak face to face instead of staring at phones. He watched confusion give way to cautious cooperation as people tried to understand what was happening without instructions from above. He had not destroyed the city. He had stripped away the systems that allowed it to function without accountability. On the rooftop, Butcher felt a strange realization settle into his mind. "He's forcing them to live without the illusion," he muttered. Homelander landed in a powerless street and looked around at people moving cautiously in candlelight. No one looked to the sky for him anymore. They were focused on each other. The stranger stopped in the middle of the avenue and turned slowly, taking in the darkened skyline. Without lights and screens, the city looked smaller, more human, less like a monument to excess, and more like a collection of lives trying to adapt. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. This was the correction. Not annihilation, not domination. Removal. He had removed the artificial power, the manufactured gods, and the systems that allowed society to hide from its own consequences. What remained was something raw, uncomfortable, and undeniably real. Butcher watched him disappear down the street and felt the weight of what had just happened. The world had not ended. It had been reset to something harsher and more honest. And there was no way back. Vought could not rebuild Compound V. Governments could not instantly restore what had been dismantled. SUPs could not reclaim their unquestioned dominance. The illusion that had defined this universe for decades had been stripped away in less than 2 days. Homelander stood alone in the darkness, realizing that he no longer understood the world he ruled. Because it wasn't his world anymore. It belonged to ordinary people now, forced to confront what they had allowed to exist for so long. Far away, the stranger continued walking toward the edge of the city without looking back. He had delivered his judgment, enacted his correction, and left the world to live with the consequences. And as dawn began to rise over a darker, quieter New York, one truth settled over everyone who had witnessed it. This was not a victory. This was a permanent change.